They called her helicopter a flying coffin and dismissed her as a relic from a forgotten war. But when a Taliban ambush trapped 12 soldiers in the mountains of Afghanistan, and every modern aircraft was grounded by the worst sandstorm in decades, Chief Warrant Officer Cassandra "Cobra" Hayes and her Vietnam-era Huey became the only thing standing between life and death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hung in the air like a suffocating blanket over forward operating Base Titan, painting everything in shades of tan and brown that seemed to blend the earth with the sky. Chief Warrant Officer Cassandra Hayes wiped the sweat from her brow as she walked the flight line, her boots crunching on the gritty surface that covered every inch of the base. At 42, she had the kind of weathered face that spoke of 2 decades flying in the world's most dangerous places, from the jungles of Central America to the deserts of Iraq, and now the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. The morning sun was already brutal, promising another day where the temperature would climb past 120 degrees. But it was the wind that caught her attention. There was something different about it today, a restless quality that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She'd learned to read weather patterns the hard way, through years of flying in conditions that would ground lesser pilots. And this wind carried the scent of something big building beyond the horizon. At the far end of the flight line, where the shadows were longest and the foot traffic lightest, sat her aircraft. The UH-1 Huey looked like a museum piece compared to the sleek Black Hawks and massive Chinooks that dominated the tarmac. Its olive drab paint was faded and chipped, streaked with oil stains and patched with newer sections that didn't quite match the original color. The rotor blades showed nicks and scratches from countless missions, and the plexiglass windows were clouded with age and sandblasting. Most of the younger pilots called it the antique when they thought she couldn't hear, though some were less charitable. Lieutenant Derek Swift, fresh from flight school and full of himself, had dubbed it the flying coffin during his first week at the base. The nickname stuck, not with malice, but with the casual dismissal that came from those who'd never seen what the old bird could do. When everything else failed, Cassandra ran her hand along the Huey's nose, feeling the familiar dents and patches. That told the story of its service. This particular aircraft, tail number 6717428, had been built in 1967 and had seen action in Vietnam, Central America, and 2 tours in Iraq before ending up in Afghanistan. It had survived rocket attacks, engine failures, and crashes that would have destroyed newer aircraft. The maintenance logs read like a war diary, chronicling repairs made under fire, parts cannibalized from other helicopters, and modifications that weren't in any technical manual. She wasn't much to look at either, if she was being honest. While the other pilots wore their flight suits with parade ground precision, hers was softened by years of real use. A folded map protruded from her chest pocket, creased and worn from constant reference. Her helmet, hanging from the pilot's seat, was covered in patches from units she'd supported over the years, a visual history of 2 decades in military aviation. That the younger pilots respected her experience, but they also saw her as a relic from an earlier era. She flew the old helicopter because that's what she'd always flown, they reasoned. She was competent, reliable, but not exciting. Not like the hotshot pilots who flew the modern aircraft with their advanced avionics and impressive capabilities. What they didn't know was that she'd been offered command of a Black Hawk unit 3 times in the past 5 years. Each time, she'd turned it down, choosing to stay with the old Huey for reasons that went deeper than simple familiarity. The truth was, she'd learned something over the years that the younger pilots hadn't yet discovered. In combat, reliability mattered more than sophistication. The Huey might not have the latest technology, but it had something more valuable: proven endurance. As she performed her morning inspection, checking fluid levels and examining the rotor head with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that Attention to detail was the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. Cassandra noticed the activity level on the base increasing. Radio chatter was picking up, and she could see officers gathering around the operations center with the urgent body language that meant something was happening. The wind gusted again, stronger this time, carrying with it the fine dust that could strip paint from aircraft and turn a clear day into a nightmare of zero visibility. She'd seen sandstorms before, but there was something about this one that felt different. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than normal, and the wind patterns were chaotic in a way that suggested something much bigger than a typical dust devil was building beyond the mountains. Sergeant First Class Anthony Wrench Davis, her crew chief, appeared at her elbow with his usual quiet efficiency. At 35, he'd been maintaining helicopters longer than some of the pilots had been alive, and his hands showed the scars and calluses of someone who'd learned his trade in the field rather than in a classroom. "Morning, Chief," he said, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who'd flown with her for 3 years. "Weather's looking interesting today." "That's one way to put it," Cassandra replied, glancing at the horizon where a wall of dust was just beginning to form. "How's our bird looking?" "Ready for whatever comes," Wrench said with the confidence of someone who'd spent the previous evening going through every system with the thoroughness of a Swiss watchmaker. "New hydraulic fluid, fresh filters, and I replaced that bearing in the tail rotor that was starting to sing. She's as ready as she's ever going to be." Cassandra nodded, appreciating the professionalism that had kept them alive through dozens of missions. Unlike the crews working on the modern aircraft, who relied on computer diagnostics and specialized tools, Wrench could diagnose problems by sound, smell, and feel. He understood the Huey's quirks and personality in a way that couldn't be taught in a technical manual. "Chief Hayes," the voice carried across the flight line with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Major Nathan Cross, the base's flight operations officer, was striding toward them with the kind of purposeful gait that meant orders were about to be issued. At 38, Cross was everything Cassandra wasn't: politically connected, academy trained, and eager to advance his career through the kind of high-visibility assignments that looked good on efficiency reports. He flew a Black Hawk when he flew at all, which wasn't often, preferring to manage operations from the comfort of the air-conditioned operations center. "Sir," Cassandra replied, coming to a relaxed position of attention that acknowledged his rank without showing the deference he clearly expected. "We're going to need all aircraft ready for potential operations today," Cross said, his eyes scanning the Huey with the kind of dismissive glance usually reserved for outdated equipment. "Intel suggests increased enemy activity in the northern sectors, and we may need to support ground units." "Roger that, sir." "We're ready." Cross's expression suggested he doubted that. "Hayes, I want you to understand that if we do launch operations, the newer aircraft will handle the primary missions. Your aircraft will be held in reserve for supply runs and non-critical transport." The pause before aircraft was deliberate, a not-so-subtle reminder that he considered the Huey more of a liability than an asset. Cassandra had heard variations of this speech for years from officers who saw military aviation as a technology competition rather than a tool for accomplishing missions. "Understood, sir," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. There was no point in arguing with Cross about the Huey's capabilities. He'd made up his mind based on age and appearance rather than performance, and nothing she said would change that. As Cross walked away, already barking orders at the crews preparing the Black Hawks, Wrench shook his head. That man wouldn't know a good aircraft if it bit him on the ass. Cassandra almost smiled. "Easy, Wrench. He's not wrong about one thing: those Black Hawks are impressive machines." "Sure," Wrench replied, "when they're working. But when the shit hits the fan, I'd rather be in something that was built to take a beating and keep flying." As if summoned by his words, The wind gusted again, stronger this time, carrying with it the first taste of the sandstorm that was building beyond the mountains. The dust devils that had been dancing on the horizon all morning were growing larger, more organized, and the sky to the north was beginning to take on the ominous brown color that meant serious weather was coming. Cassandra looked at the storm building in the distance, then at the modern aircraft lined up on the flight line like expensive jewelry. She had a feeling that before this day was over, someone was going to discover the difference between looking good and being good. The old Huey sat quietly in its corner of the flight line, weathered and scarred but ready, just like its pilot. The first emergency call came at 0800 hours, crackling through the radio with the urgency that made every pilot on the base stop what they were doing and listen. Cassandra was in the operations center, reviewing weather reports that looked increasingly ominous when the voice of Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez cut through the routine chatter. Titan Base, this is Outpost Eagle's Nest. We have enemy contact, multiple insurgents, request immediate air support. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos. Officers crowded around the radio console while Captain Diana Stone, the operations officer, grabbed the microphone. Eagle's Nest, this is Titan Base. What's your situation? We've got at least 30 Taliban fighters moving up the ridge toward our position. They've got RPGs and what looks like a recoilless rifle. We're taking heavy fire and need immediate extraction for our wounded. Cassandra felt her pulse quicken. Eagle's Nest was one of the most isolated outposts in their sector, perched on a narrow ridge in the Hindu Kush Mountains, about 40 miles north of the base. It was a strategic position for monitoring Taliban movement, but it was also a death trap if things went wrong. The outpost housed 12 soldiers, including Corporal Jessica Mitchell, a medic who'd volunteered for the dangerous assignment because she wanted to make a difference. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Rivers, the base commander, appeared at Stone's shoulder. What's the weather looking like for air support? Stone consulted her monitors, her face grim. Sir, we've got a major dust storm building from the northwest. Visibility is already dropping, and winds are gusting to 40 knots. It's going to get worse before it gets better. How long before it hits? Rivers asked. 2 hours, maybe less. And when it does, nothing's going to be flying for at least 12 hours. The radio crackled again. Titan Base, Eagle's Nest. We're taking casualties. Repeat, we have wounded personnel who need immediate medical evacuation. Rivers turned to Major Cross, who was already coordinating with the flight crews. Nathan, what do we have available? 2 Black Hawks fueled and ready, sir. We can have them airborne in 15 minutes. Do it. Cross was already moving, barking orders to the pilots who were running toward their aircraft. Captain Jennifer Brooks and Lieutenant Derek Swift, the base's most experienced Black Hawk pilots, were suiting up with the efficiency of professionals who'd done this hundreds of times before. Cassandra watched the preparations from the edge of the operations center, noting the confidence in everyone's movements. The Black Hawks were impressive machines, state-of-the-art avionics, powerful engines, and advanced defensive systems. In good weather, they could handle any mission thrown at them. But as she looked at the weather displays, she felt the familiar knot of concern in her stomach. The storm building beyond the mountains wasn't just dust, it was a haboob, a massive wall of sand and debris that could reach heights of 10,000 feet and carry winds strong enough to flip aircraft. She'd seen them before, in Iraq and earlier in Afghanistan, and they were nothing to take lightly. Major Cross, she called out, approaching the flight operations desk. Sir, I've seen storms like this before. The wind shear is going to be severe, and the dust will kill visibility completely. Those mountains create updrafts and downdrafts that can haze. Cross interrupted, not looking up from his flight charts. I appreciate your concern, but we've got this handled. The Black Hawks have advanced weather radar and GPS navigation. They can handle conditions that would ground older aircraft. The dismissal was polite but firm. Cassandra had seen it before, the assumption that newer meant better, that technology could overcome experience and instinct. She wanted to argue, to explain that weather radar couldn't predict the microbursts and wind shear that made mountain flying in dust storms so dangerous, but she knew it would fall on deaf ears. Instead, she walked to the weather station and studied the atmospheric pressure readings. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than she'd ever seen, and the wind patterns were becoming increasingly chaotic. This wasn't just a dust storm, it was a meteorological monster that was going to challenge even the most experienced pilots. The Black Hawks lifted off 20 minutes later, their turbine engines whining as they climbed into the increasingly hazy sky. Cassandra watched from the operations center as they disappeared into the brown haze that was already beginning to obscure the mountains. The radio chatter was professional and confident. Brooks and Swift were good pilots, and they knew their aircraft. But 15 minutes later, the first signs of trouble began to appear. Titan Base, this is Hawk 1. Brooks' voice came through the radio, tight with concentration. We're encountering severe turbulence and dust. Visibility is dropping fast. Roger, Hawk 1. Eagle's Nest reports the enemy is pulling back. You should have a clear landing zone. Negative, Titan Base. We can't see the landing zone. GPS shows we're in the right area, but visual contact is impossible. Cassandra moved closer to the radio, her concern growing. GPS was accurate for navigation, but it couldn't tell you about obstacles, enemy positions, or the condition of the landing zone. In mountain flying, especially in poor visibility, pilots needed to see where they were going. Hawk 1, this is Titan Base. Can you go to instruments and make an approach? There was a pause, then Brooks' voice came back, strained. Negative. Wind shear is too severe. We're getting slammed around up here. Hawk 2, are you getting this? Affirm, Hawk 1. Same conditions. My aircraft is being pushed around like a toy. Lieutenant Colonel Rivers moved to the radio. Hawk Flight, this is Titan Base Actual. What's your recommendation? Another pause, longer this time. When Brooks spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a difficult decision. Sir, we're going to have to abort. Conditions are beyond safe flying parameters. We're returning to base. The operations center fell silent. The mission was being aborted, and the soldiers at Eagle's Nest were still trapped with wounded personnel who needed immediate medical attention. Eagle's Nest, this is Titan Base, Rivers spoke into the radio. Air support is delayed due to weather conditions. Can you hold your position? Titan Base will hold as long as we can, but we've got 2 men down bad. They need a medic, and they need it soon. Rivers turned to Cross. Options? Sir, we wait for the weather to improve. Nothing can fly in these conditions. Cassandra stepped forward. Colonel, I'd like to make a suggestion. Rivers looked at her with the expression of a man who was running out of options. Go ahead, Chief. The Huey was designed for exactly these conditions, sir. Low-level flight, poor visibility, rough weather. It doesn't have the advanced systems that the Black Hawks rely on, but it doesn't need them. I can fly by dead reckoning and visual reference. I know that route, and I know what the old bird can handle. The room fell silent. Cross was already shaking his head. Hayes, the Black Hawks couldn't handle those conditions. Your aircraft is 40 years older and has none of their capabilities. With respect, sir, that's exactly why it might work. The Huey doesn't depend on GPS or weather radar. It was built to fly in bad weather with basic instruments. Sometimes simpler is better. Rivers studied her for a long moment. Chief, those are my people up there. I can't risk losing another aircraft and crew on a long shot. Sir, I understand the risk, but those soldiers are counting on us. Corporal Mitchell is up there. She's a good medic who volunteered for that assignment because she wanted to help. Are we going to let her and the others die because we're afraid to try? The debate was interrupted by another transmission from Eagle's Nest. Titan Base, this is Eagle's Nest. Enemy contact is resumed. They're moving up the ridge again, and we're almost out of ammunition. We need help, and we need it now. Rivers looked at the weather displays, then at Cassandra. Chief, if I authorize this mission, you understand you'll be flying into conditions. That just forced 2 modern aircraft to abort? Yes, sir. I understand. And you think that antique helicopter can handle what the Black Hawks couldn't? Cassandra met his gaze steadily. Sir, I think that old helicopter was built for exactly this kind of mission. And I know I can fly it there and back. Rivers was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the lives at stake. Finally he nodded. You're authorized. But Chief, bring my people home. Yes, sir. As Cassandra headed for the door, she could hear Cross protesting behind her. Sir, this is a mistake. That aircraft shouldn't be flying in these conditions. But she was already running toward the flight line, where Wrench was waiting by the Huey with the patient expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment. The storm was building on the horizon, a wall of dust and debris that looked like the end of the world. It was time to see what the old bird could do. The wind hit Cassandra like a physical blow as she stepped out of the operations center, carrying with it the fine stinging dust that could strip paint from aircraft and turn a clear day into a nightmare. The storm was closer than she'd expected. A towering wall of brown and tan that stretched from the ground to nearly 15,000 feet, moving across the landscape like a living thing with malevolent intent. Wrench was waiting by the Huey, his weathered face grim as he watched the approaching Haboob. Chief, I've seen some bad weather in my time, but this one's going to be a real bastard. How's our bird looking? Cassandra asked, pulling on her flight gloves as she approached the aircraft. Ready as she ever be, Wrench replied, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd spent the previous 3 hours going through every system with obsessive thoroughness. I've double-checked the engine oil, hydraulic fluid, and fuel systems. All filters are clean, and I've secured every panel and access door. If we're going into that storm, I want to make sure nothing comes loose. Cassandra nodded, appreciating the professionalism that had kept them alive through dozens of dangerous missions. Unlike the crews working on the modern aircraft, who relied on computer diagnostics and specialized equipment, Wrench could diagnose problems by sound, smell, and the subtle vibrations that told him when something wasn't quite right. What about survival gear? She asked, beginning her pre-flight inspection, already loaded. Extra water, emergency rations, first aid supplies, and flares. Plus I've got the rescue hoist rigged and ready in case we need to extract someone from a hot landing zone. The Huey's rescue hoist was a simple but effective system of steel cable and hook that could lift a wounded soldier from terrain too rough for landing. It wasn't as sophisticated as the systems on the newer aircraft, but it was reliable and had saved countless lives over the decades. As Cassandra walked around the aircraft, checking control surfaces and inspecting the rotor blades, she could hear the activity level on the base increasing behind her. The Black Hawks were returning from their aborted mission, their pilots no doubt frustrated by their inability to complete the rescue. She understood their frustration. They were good pilots flying capable aircraft, but they'd been defeated by conditions that their advanced systems couldn't overcome. Chief Hayes. The voice carried across the flight line with barely concealed irritation. Lieutenant Derek Swift, the young pilot who'd coined the nickname Flying Coffin for her helicopter, was approaching with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had something to say. Lieutenant, Cassandra replied, continuing her inspection. Ma'am, I just want to go on record that I think this is a bad idea. The conditions up there are beyond anything I've ever seen. The wind shear is severe enough to flip an aircraft, and the dust is so thick you can't see 50 feet in any direction. Cassandra looked at him with the patience of someone who'd been flying longer than he'd been alive. I appreciate your concern. Derek, what did you encounter up there? Microbursts, downdrafts, updrafts that came out of nowhere. The GPS was accurate, but it doesn't matter if you can't see where you're going. And the dust gets into everything. It was starting to affect our engine performance. What about altitude? How high were you flying? Swift looked puzzled by the question. Standard flight altitude for the route, about 8,000 feet. Why? Because, Cassandra said, securing a panel that Wrench had been working on. The Huey doesn't need to fly at 8,000 feet. It was designed for low-level flight, down in the weeds where the big boys don't like to go. Ma'am, flying low in those mountains is suicide. You'll hit a ridge or a tower, especially in zero visibility. Not if you know the terrain well enough to fly it by memory. Cassandra's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years learning every valley, ridge, and obstacle between the base and the outposts. The Huey was built for exactly this kind of mission, low and slow, using terrain features for navigation, getting into places where the enemy doesn't expect aircraft to operate. Swift shook his head. Ma'am, with respect, that's not how modern aviation works. We use GPS, radar, and sophisticated navigation systems because they're more accurate and safer than flying by the seat of your pants. When they work, Cassandra replied. But when the weather gets bad enough to interfere with those systems, sometimes the old ways are the only ways. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the assumption that she was taking unnecessary risks because she was too proud or too stubborn to admit that her aircraft was obsolete. What he didn't understand was that the Huey wasn't obsolete, it was specialized. It had been designed for a different kind of warfare, one where getting the mission done mattered more than looking good while doing it. Listen, Derek, she said, her voice gentler now. I know you think I'm being reckless, but I've been flying in bad weather for 20 years. I've seen what happens when pilots rely too heavily on technology and forget the basics. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Before Swift could respond, Wrench approached with a clipboard. Chief, I've got our weight and balance figured out. We're going to be flying heavy with the rescue equipment and extra fuel, but we're still within limits. Good. How's our fuel situation? Tanks are topped off, and I've got extra fuel in jerry cans secured in the cargo compartment. We should have enough for the round trip plus a healthy reserve. Cassandra nodded, then turned to Swift. Lieutenant, I want you to monitor our progress from the operations center. If we go down, someone needs to coordinate search and rescue efforts. Ma'am, I'd like to request permission to fly as your wingman. If you're going to attempt this mission, you shouldn't go alone. The offer surprised her. Despite his doubts about the mission, Swift was volunteering to share the risk. I appreciate the offer, Derek, but the Black Hawks can't handle these conditions. You proved that yourself. Then let me ride with you as co-pilot. The Huey is rated for 2 pilots, and you might need the help. Cassandra considered it for a moment. Having another pilot aboard would be useful, especially for navigation and radio communication. But it would also mean risking another life on a mission that might not succeed. All right, she said finally. But understand, this isn't going to be like anything you've flown before. We're going to be flying low, fast, and by instinct as much as instruments. If you can't handle that, speak up now. Ma'am, I can handle it. We'll see. Cassandra turned to Wrench. How long until we're ready to launch? Give me 10 minutes to finish the pre-flight, and we're good to go. As Wrench bustled around the aircraft, completing his final checks, Cassandra looked at the storm building on the horizon. The haboob was massive, a wall of dust and debris that seemed to stretch from one end of the world to the other. Flying into it would be like entering a brown void where up and down became meaningless and visibility dropped to zero. But somewhere in that storm, 12 soldiers were trapped at Eagle's Nest, fighting for their lives against superior numbers and running out of time. Among them was Corporal Jessica Mitchell, a medic who'd volunteered for the dangerous assignment because she wanted to make a difference, The radio crackled with another transmission from the outpost. Titan Base. This is Eagle's Nest. We're down to our last magazines, and we've got 3 wounded who need immediate medical attention. If you're going to try something, now would be a good time. Cassandra keyed her radio. Eagle's Nest. This is Cobra 1. We're launching in 10 minutes. Hold your position and mark your landing zone with whatever you've got. Cobra 1, Eagle's Nest. Roger that. We'll be ready. She looked at the Huey, sitting patiently in the growing wind. The old bird had flown through worse weather than this, had survived battles that would have destroyed newer aircraft, had brought countless soldiers home when everything else had failed. It was time to see if it could do it one more time. The storm was coming, and with it, the ultimate test of whether experience and determination could overcome technology and doubt. In 15 minutes, they'd either be heroes or casualties. They'd be flying towards soldiers who needed them. That was enough. The Huey's rotors began their familiar whop 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 as Cassandra brought the engine to life, the sound echoing across the flight line like a war drum announcing the beginning of battle. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust, but the vibration was steady and reassuring, the mechanical heartbeat of a machine that had been built to work, not to impress. Lieutenant Swift, now wearing a borrowed flight helmet and strapped into the co-pilot's seat, looked distinctly uncomfortable as he studied the Huey's analog instruments. The cockpit was a stark contrast to the digital displays and computerized systems he was accustomed to: round gauges with mechanical needles, switches that had actual physical weight, and radios that required manual tuning. "Jesus," he muttered, scanning the instrument panel. "It's like stepping back in time." "Welcome to analog flying," Cassandra replied, her hands moving across the controls with practiced efficiency. No GPS moving map, no weather radar, no automatic flight control systems. Just you, the aircraft, and whatever skills you've got. She advanced the throttle, feeling the familiar surge of power as the Huey lifted off from the flight line. The aircraft rose smoothly, despite the increasingly gusty winds, climbing with the steady determination of something that had been designed for exactly this kind of weather. "Titan Base, this is Cobra 1, she radioed. "Airborne and proceeding to Eagle's Nest. Estimate flight time 45 minutes. "Roger, Cobra 1. Weather is deteriorating rapidly. Winds now gusting to 50 knots. Visibility dropping to less than a quarter mile. Are you sure you want to proceed?" Cassandra looked at the storm ahead, a towering wall of brown dust that seemed to reach into the stratosphere. It was the kind of weather that grounded commercial aviation and sent military pilots running for shelter. But somewhere in that chaos, 12 soldiers were fighting for their lives. "Affirmative, Titan Base. We're proceeding." The first real taste of the storm hit them 10 minutes after takeoff. The Huey dropped suddenly as it encountered a downdraft, falling nearly 100 feet before Cassandra could recover. Swift's knuckles went white as he gripped his harness, but she barely seemed to notice the turbulence. "Is it always like this?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "This is nothing," Cassandra replied, adjusting the collective to compensate for the shifting wind patterns. "Wait until we get into the really bad stuff." She wasn't exaggerating. As they approached the mountains, the weather became increasingly violent. The wind came from all directions at once, creating turbulence that threw the helicopter around like a toy. Dust began to infiltrate the cockpit despite the sealed windows, and visibility dropped to almost zero. "How can you see where we're going?" Swift asked, peering through the windscreen at the brown void ahead. "I can't," Cassandra admitted, "but I don't need to see everything. I just need to see enough." She dropped the Huey to barely 50 feet above the ground, using the terrain features she'd memorized over 3 years of flying this route. A dry riverbed appeared and disappeared in the dust, confirming her position. A distinctive rock formation emerged from the haze for a few seconds, telling her they were on course. "Ma'am, we're flying awfully low," Swift observed, his voice betraying his nervousness. "The lower we fly, the better the visibility," Cassandra explained. "The dust is worst at altitude. Down here in the weeds, we can sometimes see 100 yards instead of 50. The radio crackled with another transmission from Eagle's Nest. "Cobra 1, this is Eagle's Nest. We're taking heavy fire again. The enemy is moving up the ridge from 3 directions. We're almost out of ammunition." "Eagle's Nest, Cobra 1. We're 20 minutes out. Can you hold?" "We'll hold as long as we can, but we're down to our last magazines. And we've got 3 wounded who need immediate medical attention." Cassandra pressed the collective forward, coaxing more speed from the old helicopter. The Huey responded with a slight increase in forward airspeed, but it was already flying at the edge of its performance envelope in the thin mountain air. "Chief," Swift said, studying the map strapped to his knee, "according to our position, we should be approaching the first ridge line. But I can't see anything." "Trust the instruments," Cassandra replied, her eyes moving constantly between the altimeter, compass, and airspeed indicator. "The ridge should be coming up in about 2 minutes. When it does, we'll need to climb fast." The ridge appeared suddenly, a dark mass looming out of the dust directly ahead. Cassandra pulled up sharply, the Huey climbing at maximum rate as the mountainside flashed by just beneath the landing gear. Swift sucked in his breath as rocks and stunted trees appeared and disappeared in the rotor wash. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How did you know it was there?" "Dead reckoning," Cassandra replied. "Time, speed, and direction. It's how pilots flew before GPS." They crested the ridge and immediately encountered the worst turbulence yet. The wind shear was severe enough to flip the aircraft if Cassandra hadn't been ready for it, applying control inputs that kept the Huey stable through sheer force of will and experience. "This is insane," Swift said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind and the strain of the engine. "We're flying blind in mountains, in a dust storm, in an aircraft that's older than I am." "That's exactly why it's working," Cassandra replied. "The Black Hawks couldn't handle this because they're too dependent on their systems. This old bird doesn't need systems, it just needs a pilot who knows how to fly it." The truth was more complex than she made it sound. The Huey was successful in these conditions because it had been designed for them. Its simple mechanical systems were less affected by dust and electrical interference. Its lower stall speed allowed it to fly safely at altitudes where the visibility was better. And its rugged construction meant it could handle the violent turbulence without breaking apart. But most importantly, it was being flown by someone who understood its capabilities and limitations. Cassandra had spent 20 years learning to read weather patterns, to navigate by terrain features, to fly by instinct when instruments failed. Skills that were becoming increasingly rare in an age of computerized aviation. "Eagle's Nest, Cobra 1, she radioed. "We're 10 minutes out. What's your status?" "Cobra 1, we're still taking fire, but the enemy seems to be pulling back. They might be getting ready for a final assault. We need you here now. Roger, stand by." Cassandra looked at the storm ahead, knowing that the worst was yet to come. The final approach to Eagle's Nest would require threading the needle between 2 mountain peaks in 0 visibility, then landing on a rocky outcrop barely large enough for the Huey's rotor disc dot in good weather. It was a challenging approach. In conditions like this, it was nearly impossible, but the soldiers at Eagle's Nest were counting on them. Corporal Mitchell was counting on them. And sometimes, impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. "Hold on," she told Swift. "This is where it gets interesting." The Huey pressed forward into the storm, its rotors beating steadily against the chaos, carrying 2 pilots and the hopes of 12 soldiers into the heart of the impossible. The final approach to Eagle's Nest was like flying through the inside of a blender filled with sand. Visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet, and the wind was coming from all directions at once, creating turbulence that would have torn apart a less rugged aircraft. Cassandra fought the controls constantly, making minute adjustments to keep the Huey stable as they navigated between mountain peaks that appeared and disappeared in the swirling dust like ghostly sentinels. "I can't see anything," Swift said, his voice tight with tension as he peered through the windscreen. "How do you know where we are?" "Feel," Cassandra replied, her hands moving across the controls with the unconscious precision of someone who'd merged with her aircraft. "The Huey's telling us everything we need to know. The way she's handling, the sound of the rotors, the vibration through the airframe, it's all information." She was right. The helicopter was communicating with them in ways that no computer system could match. The slight change in engine tone told her they were climbing. The way the aircraft wanted to drift left indicated a crosswind from the right. The subtle vibration in the collective meant they were fighting updrafts from the heated rock faces of the mountains. "Cobra 1, this is Eagle's Nest." The radio crackled with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice, strained with desperation. "We can hear your rotors, but we can't see you. The enemy is massing for what looks like a final assault. We need you on the ground now. Eagle's Nest, Cobra 1. We're close. Can you mark your position?" "Negative on flares. We're conserving everything." "We have. But we're at the eastern edge of the outcrop, about 50 meters from the cliff face. There's a large boulder to the north of our position that might help you navigate." Cassandra processed this information, building a mental picture of the landing zone. She'd been to Eagle's Nest dozens of times, but never in conditions like this. The outcrop was barely large enough for the Huey's rotor disc, with a sheer drop on 3 sides and enemy positions on the 4th. "There." Swift pointed through the dust. "I see something." A dark shape emerged from the haze, the distinctive silhouette of the communications tower that marked Eagle's Nest. It was barely visible, appearing and disappearing in the swirling dust, but it was enough to confirm their position. "Eagle's Nest, Cobra 1. We have visual on your tower. Prepare for immediate landing." "Roger, Cobra 1. We're ready." The final approach was a nightmare of precision flying. Cassandra had to descend through violent turbulence while maintaining exact positioning over a landing zone she couldn't see, using only fleeting glimpses of reference points and her intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Huey bucked and rolled in the chaotic air, but she kept it steady through sheer force of will and 2 decades of experience. "Landing zone in sight," she announced, catching a glimpse of the rocky outcrop through a brief break in the dust. "Looks like we've got about 10 feet of clearance on all sides." 10 feet? Swift's voice cracked slightly. "Ma'am, that's not enough room for error." "Then we won't make any errors," Cassandra replied, beginning her descent with the careful precision of someone landing on a postage stamp in a hurricane. The Huey settled toward the outcrop with agonizing slowness, buffeted by wind gusts that tried to push it off the narrow landing zone. Cassandra made constant corrections, fighting the controls as the aircraft wanted to drift toward the cliff face. The rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris, further reducing visibility and making the approach even more challenging. 50 feet, Swift called out, reading the altimeter. 40.30.20. The Huey shuddered as it encountered a sudden downdraft, dropping faster than Cassandra had intended. She pulled up on the collective, arresting the descent. Just as the landing gear touched down on the rocky surface, the aircraft bounced once, then settled with a thump that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. "We're down," she announced, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Wrench, get that hoist ready. We're going to need to move fast." The crew chief was already moving, preparing the rescue equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Through the cargo door, they could see figures running toward the aircraft soldiers carrying wounded comrades and equipment that needed to be evacuated. Staff. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at the cockpit window, his face streaked with dirt and blood but his eyes bright with relief. Chief Hayes, I can't believe you made it through that storm. How the hell did you find us? Good navigation and a little luck, Cassandra replied, keeping the engines running as soldiers began loading the wounded into the cargo compartment. How many casualties? 3 wounded, 2 serious. Corporal Mitchell took shrapnel in the leg, but she's been treating the others. We've also got classified equipment that needs to be destroyed or evacuated. How much time do we have? Not much. The Taliban pulled back when they heard your rotors, but they'll be back. They know we're vulnerable during the evacuation. Cassandra nodded, understanding the tactical situation. The helicopter was a sitting duck on the ground, and the enemy would use the cover of the dust storm to move closer. They needed to load the wounded and get airborne as quickly as possible. Wrench, how are we looking back there? She called over the intercom. First casualty is loaded and secured. Working on the second one now. This guy's in bad shape, looks like he took in a K. Round through the shoulder. Through the windscreen, barely visible in the swirling dust, Cassandra could see muzzle flashes in the distance. The enemy was probing, testing their defenses, looking for an opportunity to attack during the vulnerable loading process. Rodriguez, can your men provide covering fire while we finish loading? Affirmative. We've got overwatch positions on the north and west sides, but our ammunition is running low. Then we need to move fast. Cassandra turned to Swift. Keep monitoring the radios. If we get word of enemy movement, we need to be ready to lift off immediately. The loading process continued with desperate efficiency. Wounded soldiers were carried to the helicopter on improvised stretchers, their injuries attended to by Corporal Mitchell despite her own wounds. The classified equipment was loaded into secure containers and strapped down in the cargo compartment. But the storm was getting worse. The wind was picking up, and the dust was becoming so thick that visibility was dropping to 0. What had been a challenging landing was becoming an impossible takeoff. Cobra 1, this is Titan Base, the radio crackled. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We're showing winds gusting to 70 knots at your location. Recommend you wait for conditions to improve. Cassandra looked at the wounded soldiers in her cargo compartment, then at the muzzle flashes that were getting closer in the distance. Waiting wasn't an option. The enemy was closing in, and the wounded needed immediate medical attention. Negative, Titan Base. We're loaded and ready for departure. We'll take our chances with the weather. Ma'am, Swift said quietly, those wind speeds are beyond safe flying parameters. If we try to take off in this, we could lose control and crash. Cassandra looked at him with the calm expression of someone who'd already made her decision. Lieutenant, sometimes you have to choose between definitely dying and probably dying. Those soldiers will definitely die if we don't get them to a hospital. We'll probably make it if we're careful and lucky. She advanced the throttle, feeling the familiar surge of power as the Huey prepared for takeoff. The aircraft shuddered in the violent wind, but the old bird was ready for whatever came next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wounded were loaded, the classified equipment was secure, and the enemy was closing in. It was time to see if experience and determination could overcome impossible odds. One more time. The Huey lifted off into the storm, carrying its precious cargo toward home and safety, or toward a collision with the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. Either way, they were committed now. The takeoff from Eagle's Nest was the most terrifying 45 seconds of Lieutenant Swift's life. The Huey lifted off into wind shear so severe that it felt like giant hands were trying to tear the aircraft apart, while visibility dropped to absolute 0 as they climbed into the heart of the dust storm. Cassandra fought the controls with every muscle in her body, making constant adjustments to keep the helicopter stable as crosswinds tried to slam them into the mountainside. "Jesus Christ!" Swift shouted over the howling wind and the strain of the engine. "We're getting thrown around like a rag doll." "Hold on," Cassandra replied, her voice tight with concentration as she wrestled with the cyclic control. "This is the worst of it. Once we clear the peaks, the air should smooth out." But the air didn't smooth out. If anything, it got worse. The Huey was caught in a vortex of chaotic wind patterns created by the mountains and the storm, buffeted by updrafts and downdrafts that came without warning. The aircraft dropped suddenly, falling nearly 200 feet before Cassandra could arrest the descent. Then just as suddenly was caught in an updraft that threw them skyward like a cork in a whirlpool. In the cargo compartment, Wrench was fighting to keep the wounded soldiers stable while the helicopter bucked and rolled around them. The most seriously injured man, a young private who'd taken an AK-47 round through the shoulder, was unconscious and losing blood despite Corporal Mitchell's best efforts to stabilize him. "Chief," Wrench called over the intercom, "we need to get these guys to a hospital fast. The private's going into shock and his blood pressure is dropping." "Roger that," Cassandra replied, pushing the throttle forward to coax more speed from the old helicopter. 20 minutes to base. "Can you keep him stable that long?" "We'll do our best, but he needs a real surgeon, not just field medicine." The radio crackled with transmission from Titan Base. "Cobra 1, this is Titan Base. We're tracking your position on radar. You're flying through the worst part of the storm. Recommend you climb to a higher altitude to avoid the turbulence." "Negative." "Titan Base," Cassandra replied. "Higher altitude means worse visibility. We're staying low." "Cobra 1, you're showing airspeed fluctuations that suggest severe turbulence. Are you experiencing mechanical problems?" Swift looked at the instrument panel, where several warning lights were flickering intermittently. The oil pressure gauge was fluctuating, and the engine temperature was running higher than normal. The constant buffeting was taking its toll on the old helicopter's systems. "Some minor issues," Cassandra admitted, "but nothing we can't handle." The truth was more serious than she let on. The Huey was being pushed beyond its design limits, and the stress was beginning to show. The aircraft was 45 years old, and while it had been well maintained, it wasn't designed for the kind of punishment it was taking in this storm. "Ma'am," Swift said quietly, "the oil pressure is fluctuating. If we lose oil pressure, we're going to have engine problems." "I see it," Cassandra replied, her eyes moving constantly between the instruments and the limited view through the windscreen. "The engine's running hot because of the dust ingestion, but it's still within operating parameters." "Barely," Swift muttered, but he kept his concerns to himself. They were committed now, flying through the worst weather either of them had ever encountered, carrying wounded soldiers who would die if they didn't make it to base. The landscape below was completely obscured by the storm, but Cassandra navigated by dead reckoning and instinct, following the valleys and ridges she'd memorized during 3 years of flying this route. Occasionally, a familiar landmark would appear through the dust, a distinctive rock formation, or a bend in a dry riverbed, confirming their position and keeping them on course. "How much further?" Swift asked, his voice betraying his nervousness. 15 minutes, Cassandra replied. "Maybe less if this wind keeps pushing us along." But the wind was becoming increasingly chaotic. They encountered microbursts that dropped the helicopter like a stone, followed immediately by updrafts that threw them skyward. The Huey groaned and flexed around them, its airframe stressed by forces it had never been designed to handle. "Cobra 1, this is Titan Base," the radio crackled again. "We're showing multiple aircraft emergency beacons activated in your area. Are you declaring an emergency?" "Negative, Titan Base. We're experiencing rough weather, but we're maintaining control." "Roger, Cobra 1. Be advised that search and rescue Assets are standing by if needed. The offer of search and rescue was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it meant help was available if they went down. Terrifying because it implied that everyone expected them to crash. The modern Black Hawks and Chinooks were grounded by the storm, but somehow they were expected to make it through in a helicopter that was old enough to be in a museum. "Chief," Wrench called over the intercom, "the private's blood pressure is dropping fast. We're losing him." "How long can you keep him stable?" "Maybe 10 minutes. After that ... Wrench's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Cassandra pushed the throttle forward, demanding more speed from the straining engine. The Huey responded with a slight increase in airspeed, but they were already flying at the edge of the performance envelope. The thin mountain air and the weight of the wounded soldiers were taking their toll on the old helicopter's capabilities. "There!" Swift pointed through the windscreen. "I can see lights." Through a brief break in the dust, they could see the approach lights of Titan Base, barely visible in the distance, but unmistakably familiar. They were almost home. "Titan Base, this is Cobra 1, Cassandra radioed. "Request immediate clearance for emergency medical landing. We have 3 wounded on board, 1 critical. Cobra 1, you're cleared for immediate landing. Medical team is standing by. Runway is clear." The final approach to Titan Base was almost anticlimactic after what they'd been through. The base was on the edge of the storm, and while the wind was still strong, it was nothing compared to the chaos they'd experienced in the mountains. The Huey settled onto the landing pad with a thump that spoke of an aircraft that had been pushed to its limits. "We're down," Cassandra announced, her voice hoarse from the strain of the flight. "Wrench, get those casualties to the medical team." The evacuation was swift and professional. The wounded soldiers were transferred to waiting ambulances, with the critically injured private rushed directly to the base hospital. Corporal Mitchell, despite her own injuries, insisted on accompanying her patients to ensure continuity of care. As the medical team worked, Cassandra shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for a moment, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline and exhaustion. They'd done it. They'd flown through the worst weather any of them had ever encountered, rescued 12 soldiers from certain death, and brought them home safely. "Ma'am," Swift said quietly, "that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. I don't think any other pilot could have done what you just did." "It wasn't just me," Cassandra replied, patting the instrument panel affectionately. "This old bird did most of the work. Sometimes the best technology is the one that just refuses to quit." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the base, 12 soldiers were safe and 3 wounded men were receiving the medical care they needed. The mission was complete, but the real test was just beginning, because now they had to explain to the brass how a 45-year-old helicopter and a logistics pilot had succeeded where modern aircraft and tactical pilots had failed. The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Titan was thick with tension and the smell of strong coffee when Cassandra entered 3 hours after landing. The storm was still raging outside, but inside the climate-controlled building, a different kind of storm was brewing. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Rivers sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by Major Nathan Cross and Captain Diana Stone. Their faces were unreadable, but Cassandra could sense the mixture of relief, amazement, and bureaucratic concern that always followed successful missions that shouldn't have been possible. "Chief Hayes," Rivers began, his voice carefully neutral, "have a seat. We need to discuss what happened today." Cassandra settled into the offered chair, noting that Lieutenant Swift was already present, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. The young pilot had been unusually quiet since their return, still processing what he'd experienced during the mission. "First," Rivers continued, "let me say that what you accomplished today was extraordinary. You rescued 12 soldiers from certain death, including 3 wounded who are now receiving treatment at the base hospital. The private you evacuated is stable and expected to make a full recovery. Thank you, sir. How are the others? Corporal Mitchell is being treated for shrapnel wounds, but refused morphine until she was certain her patients were stable. The other wounded soldiers are in good condition. All 12 members of the Eagle's Nest team are accounted for and safe. Cassandra nodded, feeling the weight of relief that came with mission success. But she could sense there was more to come. Major Cross leaned forward, his expression skeptical. Chief, I need to understand how you were able to complete a mission that forced 2 Black Hawks to abort. The weather conditions were beyond anything in our operational parameters. Sir, the Huey was designed for exactly those conditions. Low altitude, flight in poor visibility, using terrain masking and basic navigation techniques. Sometimes the old ways work when new technology fails. That's not an answer, Cross replied sharply. I need specifics. How did you navigate in zero visibility? How did you find Eagle's Nest without GPS guidance? How did you land on that outcrop when trained tactical pilots couldn't even attempt an approach? Cassandra chose her words carefully. Sir, I've been flying that route for 3 years. I know every ridge, every valley, every landmark. When visibility is limited, you rely on dead reckoning, terrain association, and instinct. The Huey's analog instruments don't fail when dust interferes with electronic systems. Instinct? Cross's voice carried a note of disdain. Chief, we're talking about military aviation, not some bush pilot operation. We have procedures, protocols, and safety standards for a reason. And those procedures nearly got 12 soldiers killed. Cassandra replied, her voice remaining steady despite the implied criticism. Sir, with respect, sometimes following the book isn't enough. Sometimes you have to adapt to the situation. Rivers held up a hand to interrupt the exchange. The mission was successful, and that's what matters. But Major Cross raises valid concerns about operational standards and risk management. Captain Stone consulted her notes. Chief, the technical analysis of your flight shows that you exceeded several performance parameters. You flew below minimum safe altitude, operated in weather conditions that should have grounded all aircraft, and landed in a zone that was barely suitable for helicopter operations. Ma'am, all true. But the alternative was leaving those soldiers to die. The alternative, Cross interjected, was waiting for conditions to improve or finding a different solution. You took unnecessary risks with valuable equipment and personnel. Cassandra felt her patience beginning to fray. Sir, Corporal Mitchell was treating 2 soldiers who were bleeding out in a combat zone. The enemy was massing for a final assault, and Eagle's Nest was almost out of ammunition. There was no time to wait for better weather or explore alternatives. You don't know that, Cross argued. The weather might have improved. The enemy might have withdrawn. There might have been other options. Might have, Cassandra repeated. Sir, military operations are based on known factors and calculated risks. I knew the capabilities of my aircraft. I knew the terrain, and I knew the tactical situation. Everything else was speculation. Lieutenant Swift spoke up for the first time. Sir, if I may, Chief Hayes demonstrated flying skills that I didn't know were possible. She navigated through zero visibility conditions using techniques that aren't taught in flight school anymore. Without her expertise, those soldiers would have died. Cross turned his attention to the young pilot. Lieutenant, you're not qualified to make that assessment. You have less than 2 years of operational experience. But I was there, sir. I saw what she did. The Black Hawks couldn't handle the conditions because they're dependent on electronic systems that were compromised by the dust. The Huey succeeded because it's simple, robust, and flown by someone who understands its capabilities. That's enough, Rivers said firmly. This isn't a debate about aircraft capabilities or flying techniques. This is about whether Chief Hayes followed proper procedures and made sound decisions under pressure. The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, Cassandra spoke. "Colonel, I understand your concerns about procedure and protocol. But I've been flying in combat zones for 20 years, and I've learned that sometimes you have to choose between following rules and saving lives. I chose to save lives. And if you had crashed, Cross demanded, if you had killed yourself and Lieutenant Swift while destroying a valuable aircraft, would that have been worth it?" "Sir, that's a hypothetical question. We didn't crash. We completed the mission successfully." "But you could have crashed. The risks were enormous." Cassandra met his gaze steadily. "Sir, everything we do in a combat zone involves risk. Flying combat missions is inherently dangerous. The question isn't whether there's risk, it's whether the risk is justified by the potential outcome." "And you believed it was justified?" "I knew it was justified. 12 soldiers were trapped in a combat zone with wounded personnel and no hope of rescue unless someone was willing to take the risk. I was willing to take that risk." Rivers leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of a commander weighing difficult decisions. "Chief, your actions today violated several regulations and safety protocols. Under normal circumstances, that would result in disciplinary action." Cassandra braced herself for what was coming. "However," Rivers continued, "these were not normal circumstances. You rescued 12 soldiers from certain death, including 3 wounded who are now receiving life-saving medical treatment. Your actions, while unconventional, were successful and potentially saved multiple lives. Sir, I take full responsibility for my decisions and their consequences. I know you do. That's why I'm not pursuing disciplinary action. But Chief, I need you to understand that we can't have pilots regularly ignoring safety protocols and operational procedures. The military requires discipline and adherence to standards." "Yes, sir, I understand." "Good. Now let's talk about what happens next." Cassandra looked at him with interest. "Sir, Chief, today you demonstrated capabilities that we've been ignoring. You showed that there's value in experience, instinct, and unconventional thinking. I'd like to discuss ways to incorporate those qualities into our operational planning." Major Cross looked surprised. "Sir, are you suggesting we change our procedures based on one successful mission?" "I'm suggesting we consider all available assets and capabilities when planning operations. Chief Hayes and that old helicopter represent resources we haven't been fully utilizing." Rivers turned back to Cassandra. "Chief, I'm creating a new position, Special Operations Liaison. Your job will be to provide expertise on unconventional flying techniques, old-school navigation methods, and aircraft capabilities that our younger pilots might not understand." "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for a special operations role." "You're qualified by results," Rivers replied. "Today proved that sometimes the best solution is the one that everyone else thinks is impossible." As the meeting concluded and the officers filed out, Cassandra remained in her chair for a moment, processing what had just happened. She'd expected a reprimand, possibly even a court-martial. Instead, she'd been offered a promotion and a new role that would allow her to continue flying challenging missions. Lieutenant Swift approached her as she gathered her notes. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for including me in the mission today. I learned more about flying in those 3 hours than I did in 6 months of training. You did good work, Derek. You kept your head when things got rough." "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Sure. How did you know we'd make it? When we were taking off from Eagle's Nest in that storm, how did you know we wouldn't crash?" Cassandra smiled. "I didn't know. But I knew that not trying meant those soldiers would definitely die. Sometimes you have to have faith in your aircraft, your training, and your ability to adapt to whatever comes." "Faith," Swift repeated. "That's not something they teach in flight school." "No," Cassandra agreed. "It's something you learn in the field, usually the hard way." As they left the debriefing room, the storm outside was finally beginning to subside. But the real storm, the one that would change how Forward Operating Base Titan approached impossible missions, was just beginning. News of the Eagle's Nest rescue spread through Forward Operating Base Titan like wildfire, carried by the kind of informal network that exists in every military installation. By evening, everyone from the mess hall cooks to the intelligence analysts had heard some version of the story. The old helicopter that everyone called a flying coffin had succeeded where the modern aircraft had failed, flown by the quiet woman who processed supply requisitions and never asked for glory. Cassandra tried to maintain her normal routine, but it was impossible to ignore the changed atmosphere on base. Soldiers who had barely acknowledged her existence before now nodded respectfully when she passed. Mechanics who had previously dismissed the Huey as obsolete were suddenly interested in its maintenance requirements and operational capabilities. Chief Hayes called out Specialist Maria Santos, a young communications technician who worked in the operations center. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you for what you did today. My cousin was stationed at Eagle's Nest, Corporal Mitchell," she said. "You saved all their lives." "I was just doing my job, Specialist," Cassandra replied, uncomfortable with the attention. "The important thing is that everyone made it home safely." "Ma'am, with respect, that wasn't just doing your job. That was going above and beyond." "Corporal, Mitchell said you landed in conditions that should have been impossible." The praise was genuine, but it made Cassandra uncomfortable. She'd never been one to seek recognition, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But she was beginning to understand that what had happened at Eagle's Nest was more than just a successful mission. It was a symbol of something larger. First indication of how much things had changed came the next morning, when she arrived at the flight line to find Lieutenant Swift and 3 other pilots gathered around the Huey. They were examining the helicopter with new interest, studying its construction and asking wrench-detailed questions about its capabilities. "Morning, Chief," Swift said, straightening to attention as she approached. "We were just learning about the Huey systems from Sergeant Davis. It's remarkable how different it is from modern aircraft." "Different how?" Cassandra asked, curious about their perspective. "Well, for one thing, it's completely mechanical," replied Captain Tom Miller, one of the Black Hawk pilots. "No computers, no fly-by-wire systems, no electronic flight controls. If something breaks, you can actually see what's wrong and fix it with basic tools. That's the beauty of it," Wrench added, his pride in the old helicopter evident. "These new birds are impressive, but they're so complex that you need specialized diagnostic equipment just to figure out what's wrong. With the Huey, you can troubleshoot problems by listening to the engine and feeling the vibrations." Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes, a Chinook pilot who'd arrived at the base just 2 weeks earlier, shook her head in amazement. "I've been flying helicopters for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did yesterday. Flying in zero visibility, navigating by dead reckoning, landing on a postage stamp in a crosswind, it's like something out of a movie. It's not movie flying," Cassandra explained. "It's old-school flying. Before GPS and weather radar, pilots had to rely on basic navigation techniques and aircraft handling skills. The Huey was designed for that kind of flying." "But how do you learn those skills?" Miller asked. "I mean, our training focused on modern navigation systems and electronic flight controls. We never learned to fly by dead reckoning or terrain." "Association, experience," Cassandra replied, "and willingness to push yourself beyond what's comfortable. The military tends to focus on standardized procedures and technology-based solutions, but sometimes the old ways are the best ways." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Cross, who approached the group with his characteristic air of authority. "What's going on here?" he asked, noting the unusual gathering around the Huey. "Sir, we were just learning about the helicopter's capabilities," Swift explained. Chief Hayes was explaining some of the navigation techniques she used during yesterday's mission. Cross's expression tightened. "Lieutenant, I hope you're not suggesting that we abandon modern navigation systems in favor of outdated techniques. No, sir. But it might be valuable to understand both approaches. Yesterday showed that technology can fail when you need it most. Technology failures are rare, Cross replied. And when they do occur, we have backup systems and procedures to handle them. Sir, with respect, the backup systems failed too, Miller pointed out. The weather was too severe for any of our electronic navigation aids to function properly. That's why the Black Hawks couldn't complete the mission. Cross looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Gentlemen, let's not lose sight of the fact that yesterday's mission was successful because of luck as much as skill. We can't base our operational procedures on exceptional circumstances. Major, I disagree, came the new voice. Everyone turned to see Colonel William Harrison, the wing commander, approaching the group. Harrison was a decorated combat veteran with over 25 years of service, and his opinion carried significant weight. Sir, Cross said, snapping to attention. I was just discussing yesterday's mission with the pilots. Good, because I want to hear about it too. Harrison turned to Cassandra. Chief Hayes, I've read the preliminary reports, but I'd like to hear your perspective on what made yesterday's mission successful. Cassandra felt the weight of all eyes on her. Sir, I think it succeeded because we matched the aircraft to the mission requirements. The Huey was designed for low-altitude flight in poor visibility, using simple navigation techniques that don't depend on electronic systems. And the modern aircraft couldn't handle those conditions? Sir, the Black Hawks are excellent aircraft, but they're optimized for different kinds of missions. They rely on sophisticated systems that can be compromised by severe weather. The Huey is simpler, but that simplicity makes it more reliable in extreme conditions. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Chief, I've been in the military for over 2 decades, and I've seen technology solve a lot of problems. But I've also seen situations where technology became a liability rather than an asset. Yesterday sounds like one of those situations. Yes. Sir, I believe it was. Major Cross, Harrison continued, I want you to work with Chief Hayes to develop a training program that incorporates both modern and traditional navigation techniques. Our pilots should understand how to fly when their electronic systems fail. Cross looked distinctly uncomfortable. Sir, I'm not sure that's necessary. Our electronic systems are highly reliable, and we have backup procedures for system failures. Major, yesterday those backup procedures weren't enough. If Chief Hayes hadn't been willing to risk her career and her life, we'd have lost 12 soldiers. That's not acceptable. Sir, I understand, but no buts, Harrison interrupted. I want our pilots to be prepared for any situation, including situations where technology fails. Chief Hayes demonstrated skills that we've been ignoring, and I want those skills incorporated into our training programs. The colonel turned back to Cassandra. Chief, I'm also interested in your assessment of our aircraft inventory. We've been focused on acquiring the latest technology, but yesterday suggested that older aircraft might have capabilities we've been overlooking. Sir, I think there's value in maintaining a diverse fleet. Different aircraft are suited for different missions, and sometimes the best tool for the job is the one that everyone else thinks is obsolete. Agreed. I want you to conduct a comprehensive review of our aircraft capabilities and make recommendations for optimizing our fleet composition. As Harrison walked away, Cross turned to Cassandra with barely concealed frustration. Chief, I hope you understand that this conversation has just complicated a lot of people's lives. Changing established procedures and training programs isn't simple. Sir, I understand. But if it prevents future tragedies, isn't it worth the effort? Cross didn't answer, but his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. As the group dispersed, Cassandra remained by the Huey, thinking about the conversation and its implications. Chief, Swift said quietly, I think you've started something bigger than just a successful mission. What do you mean? I mean, you've challenged the assumption that newer is always better. That's going to make some people uncomfortable, but it's also going to save lives." Cassandra looked at the old helicopter, its faded paint and weathered appearance unchanged by its moment of glory. "Derek, sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. The military has a tendency to focus on the latest technology, but there's still value in the old ways." "I'm beginning to understand that," Swift replied. "Yesterday taught me more about flying than 6 months of training." As the sun set over Forward Operating Base Titan, Cassandra realized that the mission to Eagle's Nest had changed more than just the lives of 12 soldiers. It had challenged assumptions, sparked conversations, and possibly started a revolution in how the military approached impossible problems. The old Huey sat quietly on the flight line, ready for whatever mission came next. Just like its pilot, it had proven that sometimes the best solution was the one that everyone else thought was impossible. 3 weeks after the Eagle's Nest rescue, Cassandra found herself standing in front of a classroom full of pilots, instructors, and senior officers from across the theater of operations. The hastily assembled conference room at Bagram Airfield was packed with personnel who had flown in from bases throughout Afghanistan to attend what had officially been termed Alternative Aviation Techniques and Legacy Aircraft Capabilities Assessment. Unofficially, everyone knew it as the Huey hearing, a gathering designed to determine whether the success at Eagle's Nest was a fluke or evidence of capabilities that the military had been systematically overlooking. The stakes were higher than anyone wanted to admit. If Cassandra's methods were deemed too dangerous or unreliable, it would effectively end any discussion of incorporating traditional flying techniques into modern operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," began Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins, the Regional Aviation Commander, "we're here today to examine an incident that has generated significant discussion throughout our command structure. 3 weeks ago, Chief Warrant Officer Cassandra Hayes completed a rescue mission that had been deemed impossible by our standard operational assessments." The room was silent, filled with the kind of tension that comes when careers and institutional policies hang in the balance. Cassandra could see familiar faces in the audience: Lieutenant Swift, who had volunteered to testify about the mission; Major Cross, who still appeared skeptical; and Colonel Harrison, who had become an unexpected advocate for expanding the military's operational thinking. "The mission in question," General Hawkins continued, "involved the rescue of 12 soldiers from a forward outpost during weather conditions that had grounded all other aircraft. The rescue was completed using a UH-1 helicopter of Vietnam-era aircraft that many considered obsolete for modern operations." A murmur ran through the room. About half the attendees had heard only rumors about the mission, and the details were more dramatic than many had expected. "Chief Hayes," the general said, "would you please describe the conditions you encountered during the mission?" Cassandra stood, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. "Ma'am, we encountered a Habubi severe dust storm with winds gusting to 70 knots and visibility near zero. The storm had forced 2 Black Hawks to abort their rescue attempts due to equipment limitations and safety concerns." "And you decided to proceed despite these conditions?" "Yes, ma'am. The soldiers at Eagle's Nest were under enemy fire with wounded personnel who needed immediate medical attention. Waiting for the weather to improve wasn't an option." "Explain your decision-making process." Cassandra chose her words carefully. "Ma'am, I assessed the mission requirements against the capabilities of available aircraft. The Huey was designed for low-altitude flight in poor visibility using navigation techniques that don't depend on electronic systems. The severe weather that defeated the modern aircraft actually played to the Huey's strengths." Colonel James Mitchell, the base operations commander from Kandahar, leaned forward. "Chief, are you suggesting that a 45-year-old helicopter is superior to modern aircraft?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting that different aircraft are suited for different missions. The Black Hawks are excellent for what they're designed to do, But this mission required capabilities that the Huey possessed, and they didn't, such as mechanical reliability in dusty conditions, the ability to fly safely at very low altitudes, and navigation systems that function when electronic equipment fails. Major Sarah Chun, a test pilot from the Army Aviation Development Command, consulted her notes. "Chief, our analysis of your flight shows that you exceeded several safety parameters. You flew below minimum safe altitude, operated in weather conditions outside normal parameters, and landed in a zone that was marginally suitable for helicopter operations." "Yes, ma'am, all true. How do you justify those decisions?" Cassandra met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, safety parameters are guidelines for normal operations. When 12 soldiers are dying and conventional approaches have failed, you have to weigh the risks differently. But if you had crashed, you would have added to the casualties rather than preventing them." "Ma'am, that's a valid point. But the soldiers at Eagle's Nest were going to die if someone didn't take the risk." The question wasn't whether there was danger, it was whether the danger was justified by the potential outcome. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Torres, a senior instructor pilot, spoke up. "Chief, let's talk about navigation. How did you find Eagles Nest in zero visibility without GPS guidance?" "Sir, I used dead reckoning and terrain association. I've flown that route dozens of times, and I know every ridge, valley, and landmark. When you can't see far, you navigate by time, speed, and direction, confirming your position with whatever visual references you can find. That's extremely dangerous. What if you had miscalculated?" "Sir, it would have been dangerous. But it was less dangerous than leaving those soldiers to die." The questions continued for over an hour, covering every aspect of the mission in exhaustive detail. Some officers seemed genuinely interested in understanding the techniques Cassandra had used. Others appeared to be looking for evidence that the mission had been reckless or lucky rather than skillful. Finally, General Hawkins called for a break. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll reconvene in 15 minutes to hear from other witnesses." During the break, Cassandra found herself surrounded by pilots asking technical questions about the Huey's capabilities and the navigation techniques she'd employed. The conversation was intense and professional, but she could sense the underlying tension between those who saw value in traditional methods and those who viewed them as dangerously outdated. "Chief Hayes," called out Captain Lisa Rodriguez, a Black Hawk pilot from Forward Operating Base Shank. "I've been flying in Afghanistan for 18 months, and I've never attempted the kind of low-level navigation you described. How do you develop those skills?" "Practice," Cassandra replied, "and willingness to push beyond what's comfortable. The military tends to focus on standardized procedures, but sometimes you need to adapt to circumstances that aren't covered in the manual." "But how do you practice flying in zero visibility? It seems like you'd be risking lives just for training." "You start small," Cassandra explained. "Short flights in marginal weather, gradually building experience and confidence. You learn to read the aircraft's behavior, to feel changes in wind and altitude through the controls. It's not something you can learn from a textbook." Major Cross approached the group, his expression skeptical. "Chief, what you're describing sounds like the kind of cowboy flying that gets people killed. We have standardized procedures and safety protocols for a reason." "Sir, I'm not advocating for abandoning safety protocols. I'm suggesting that we need to understand the difference between unnecessary risk and calculated risk in extreme circumstances. And who makes that determination? How do we prevent pilots from taking foolish chances because they think they're being heroic?" Before Cassandra could answer, Lieutenant Swift joined the conversation. "Sir, if I may, I was in the aircraft during the mission." Chief Hayes wasn't taking foolish chances. She was applying decades of experience to a situation that required unconventional solutions. "Lieutenant, you have less than 2 years of flight experience. How are you qualified to make that assessment?" "Because I was there," Swift replied firmly. I saw how she handled the aircraft, how she navigated in impossible conditions, how she made decisions under pressure. It wasn't luck or recklessness, it was skill. The conversation was interrupted by General Hawkins calling the session back to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now hear from Lieutenant Swift, who served as co-pilot during the mission. As Swift took the podium, Cassandra realized that the next few hours would determine not just her own future, but the future of military aviation's relationship with traditional flying techniques. The military establishment was being forced to confront the possibility that their focus on technology and standardization might have caused them to overlook valuable capabilities. The room fell silent as Swift began his testimony. "Ma'am, I want to start by saying that what I witnessed during the Eagle's Nest mission changed my understanding of what's possible in military aviation. Chief Hayes didn't just complete an impossible mission, she demonstrated that there are still valuable lessons to be learned from the old ways of flying." The test was just beginning, but Cassandra could sense that something fundamental was shifting in the room. The question was no longer whether the mission had been successful, but whether the military was ready to embrace the lessons it had taught. Lieutenant Swift's testimony was methodical and compelling. He described in technical detail how Cassandra had navigated through zero visibility conditions, how she had used terrain features and dead reckoning to find Eagle's Nest, and how she had safely landed and taken off in weather that had defeated more modern aircraft. His account was delivered with the precision of someone who understood that careers and institutional policies hung in the balance. "Ma'am," Swift concluded, "I want to be clear that what Chief Hayes accomplished wasn't luck or recklessness. It was the application of flying skills that I didn't know still existed in the military. Skills that might be the difference between life and death when technology fails." The room remained silent as Swift returned to his seat. General Hawkins consulted her notes before speaking again. "We'll now hear from Sergeant First Class Anthony Davis, the crew chief who maintained the aircraft and participated in the mission." Wrench approached the podium with the confident stride of someone who had spent 30 years working on helicopters and had seen everything the military could throw at him. His testimony focused on the technical aspects of the mission, how the Huey's simple mechanical systems had functioned reliably in conditions that would have compromised more complex aircraft. "Ma'am," he said, "I've worked on everything from Vietnam-era Hueys to the latest Black Hawks, and I can tell you that there's value in both approaches. The new birds are impressive, but they're also fragile. When the environment gets hostile dust, extreme temperatures, electronic interference, sometimes the old-school mechanical systems are more reliable." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward. "Sergeant, are you suggesting that we should replace our modern aircraft with Vietnam-era helicopters?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting that we should understand what each aircraft can and can't do. The Huey succeeded because it was the right tool for the job. If we'd tried to force a Black Hawk into that mission, we might have lost the aircraft and crew." The technical testimony continued for another hour, with maintenance specialists, meteorologists, and tactical experts all weighing in on different aspects of the mission. The picture that emerged was complex. The Eagle's Nest rescue had succeeded, not because of any single factor, but because of the combination of appropriate aircraft selection, skilled piloting, and the willingness to use unconventional techniques when conventional approaches failed. Finally, General Hawkins called for the testimony that everyone had been waiting for. "We'll now hear from Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, the senior non-commissioned officer at Eagle's Nest during the incident." Rodriguez approached the podium with the bearing of a combat veteran who had seen too much to be impressed by rank or politics. His testimony was brief but powerful. "Ma'am, I want to start by saying that Chief Hayes saved our lives. We were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. We had 3 wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention and no way to get them to safety. When the Black Hawks couldn't make it through the storm, we thought we were done for." He paused, his voice carrying the weight of memory. Then we heard the Huey. At first we couldn't believe it. The weather was so bad that we couldn't see 50 feet in any direction. But Chief Hayes found us, landed in conditions that should have been impossible, and got us out. Without her, we'd all be dead. The room was absolutely silent. Rodriguez continued, "Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of brave things. But what Chief Hayes did that day was something special. She didn't just risk her career, she risked her life to save soldiers she'd never met. That's the kind of leadership that makes the military work." When Rodriguez finished, General Hawkins called for a final break before deliberations. The room erupted in quiet conversations as officers processed what they had heard. Cassandra found herself surrounded by pilots and commanders who wanted to discuss the technical aspects of the mission, the policy implications, and the lessons learned. "Chief Hayes," called out Brigadier General Robert Kim, the Deputy Commander of Aviation Operations, "I've been in the military for 28 years, and I've never seen a mission report quite like this one. You've challenged some fundamental assumptions about how we approach aviation operations." "Sir, I didn't intend to challenge anything. I was just trying to save lives. I understand that. But the implications go beyond a single mission. You've demonstrated that we may have been too quick to dismiss older aircraft and traditional flying techniques." Colonel Torres, the senior instructor pilot, joined the conversation. "Chief, I've been thinking about your navigation techniques. We don't teach dead reckoning in flight school anymore because we assume GPS will always be available. But what happens when it's not?" "Sir, that's exactly the point. Technology is a tool, not a crutch. When it fails, pilots need to fall back on basic skills. But how do we incorporate that into training without compromising safety?" "Gradually," Cassandra replied. "Start with simple exercises in good weather, then gradually increase the complexity as pilots build confidence and experience. The goal isn't to replace modern navigation systems, it's to ensure that pilots can function when those systems fail." The conversation was interrupted by General Hawkins calling the session back to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, after reviewing all testimony and evidence, this panel has reached several conclusions regarding the Eagle's Nest mission and its implications for military aviation operations." The room fell silent with anticipation. First, we find that Chief Hayes' actions during the mission were justified by the circumstances and resulted in the successful rescue of 12 soldiers who would otherwise have died. Her decision-making process was sound, and her execution was exemplary. Cassandra felt a wave of relief, but she sensed there was more to come. Second, we find that the mission demonstrates the value of maintaining diverse aircraft capabilities and pilot skill sets. The success of the UH-1 in conditions that defeated more modern aircraft suggests that we may have been too quick to dismiss older platforms. Major Cross looked uncomfortable with the direction of the findings, but he remained silent. Third, we recommend the establishment of a specialized training program that incorporates traditional navigation and flying techniques alongside modern systems. This program will be designed to ensure that our pilots can operate effectively when electronic systems fail or are compromised. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the implications of the recommendations sank in. Finally, General Hawkins continued, "We recommend that Chief Hayes be assigned to lead the development and implementation of this training program. Her demonstrated expertise in traditional flying techniques and her ability to apply them in extreme circumstances make her uniquely qualified for this role." The session concluded with a mixture of applause and concerned murmurs as officers processed the implications of the panel's findings. Cassandra found herself surrounded by congratulations, but she was more focused on the work ahead than on the recognition. As the crowd dispersed, Lieutenant Swift approached her. "Chief, congratulations. You've just changed military aviation." "Derek, I hope I've made it better." The military needs to balance tradition with innovation, experience with technology. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. What happens now? Cassandra looked out the window at the flight line, where helicopters of all ages and types sat ready for mission tasking. Now we teach a new generation of pilots that sometimes the best solution is the one that everyone else thinks is impossible. The hearing was over, but the real work was just beginning. The military had officially acknowledged that there was value in the old ways, and now it was up to Cassandra to prove that those ways could be taught, learned, and applied safely in modern operations. The old Huey had done more than complete a rescue mission. It had started a revolution in military thinking. And sometimes that was the most important mission of all. 6 months after the Eagle's Nest rescue, Cassandra stood in front of a classroom at the newly established Traditional Flight Techniques Training Center at Fort Rucker, Alabama. The facility was modest, a converted hangar with classroom space, flight simulators, and a collection of aircraft that most military aviators had written off as museum pieces. But for Cassandra, it represented something far more significant: the institutionalization of lessons learned through decades of real-world flying. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the first class of students in the Enhanced Aviation Skills program. "Welcome to what some people are calling old-school flight training. I prefer to think of it as complete pilot training learning. To fly when all your fancy systems fail and you're left with nothing but basic aircraft, basic instruments, and whatever skills you've managed to develop." The classroom was filled with pilots from all branches of the military, ranging from recent flight school graduates to senior officers with thousands of flight hours. They were here because their commands had recognized a truth that the Eagle's Nest mission had made impossible to ignore. In an era of increasing technological sophistication, the military had lost touch with fundamental flying skills that could mean the difference between life and death when systems failed. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Swift, now serving as Cassandra's deputy, stood at the back of the room. His promotion and assignment to the program had surprised many, but his first-hand experience during the Eagle's Nest mission had made him one of the most effective advocates for traditional training methods. He'd spent the past 6 months traveling to bases throughout the world, documenting situations where electronic navigation systems had failed and pilots had been forced to rely on basic flying skills they'd never been taught. "Ma'am," raised her hand Captain Jennifer Brooks, one of the Black Hawk pilots who had been forced to abort the original rescue mission. "I have to admit, I was skeptical when I was assigned to this program. I've been flying for 8 years, and I've never encountered a situation where my GPS or navigation systems failed completely." "That's exactly why you're here," Cassandra replied. "Captain, you're an excellent pilot, but your training has focused on operating sophisticated aircraft with reliable electronic systems. What happens when you're flying in hostile territory and your aircraft takes damage that knocks out your GPS, your radio, and your navigation computer? I have to improvise, I suppose. Improvisation isn't enough when lives are at stake. You need skills that are so deeply ingrained that you can apply them instinctively, even under extreme stress." The program that Cassandra had developed was unlike anything in military aviation training. Students learned to navigate using paper maps, compass headings, and terrain features. They practiced flying in aircraft with minimal electronic systems, developing the ability to read wind patterns, weather conditions, and aircraft behavior through sensory input rather than digital displays. "The goal," Cassandra explained, "isn't to replace modern navigation systems. It's to ensure that you can function effectively when those systems fail. And they will fail, usually at the worst possible moment." The training was challenging in ways that many students hadn't expected. Captain Maria Santos, a Chinook pilot with over 2,000 flight hours, found herself struggling with dead-reckoning navigation on her first training flight. "Chief Hayes," she said after landing, "I've been flying for 6 years, and I feel like I'm starting over." I never realized how dependent I'd become on my GPS. That's not a criticism of your skills, Cassandra replied. It's a reflection of how military aviation training has evolved. We've become so focused on operating complex systems that we've forgotten the fundamental skills that those systems are supposed to enhance, not replace. The program's aircraft fleet was intentionally diverse, ranging from Vietnam-era Hueys to modern helicopters with their electronic systems disabled. Students learned to fly each aircraft type using only basic instruments and manual controls, developing an understanding of aircraft behavior that couldn't be taught through computer simulations. The Huey is our primary training aircraft, Cassandra explained to the class, because it forces you to develop fundamental flying skills. There's no autopilot, no GPS, no computerized flight controls. If you can fly a Huey competently, you can fly anything. The training wasn't just about flying techniques, it was about developing a different mindset. Students learned to think like pilots from earlier generations who had operated aircraft with minimal technology and had relied on skill, experience, and judgment to complete missions. Chief Hayes asked Major Robert Kim, a senior instructor, pilot who had been assigned to evaluate the program, "How do you measure success in this training?" Traditional flight training has clear metrics: successful landings, navigation accuracy, procedural compliance. But what you're teaching seems more subjective. Major, success is measured by results. Can the pilot navigate to a destination without GPS? Can they land safely in challenging conditions? Can they make sound decisions when their electronic systems fail? These are skills that can be taught, learned, and measured. The program's first real test came 4 months after its inception, when a Black Hawk conducting a medical evacuation mission in Iraq suffered multiple system failures due to a dust storm. The pilot, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, was a recent graduate of Cassandra's program. "I lost GPS, radio, and most of my navigation systems," Rodriguez reported after the mission. "But I was able to navigate back to base using dead reckoning and terrain features, just like Chief Hayes taught us. The techniques I learned in the program saved my crew and my patients." Word of the successful mission spread quickly through military aviation circles, lending credibility to the program and increasing demand for training slots. Senior officers who had initially been skeptical began requesting that their pilots be included in the program. "The thing about traditional flying techniques," Cassandra told her students during a particularly challenging training session, "is that they're not really traditional at all. They're fundamental. They're the foundation that all other flying skills are built on. We just forgot that for a while." The program also included maintenance training, teaching crew chiefs and mechanics to diagnose and repair aircraft using basic tools and techniques. Wrench, now serving as the program's senior maintenance instructor, emphasized the importance of understanding aircraft systems at a fundamental level. "These new aircraft are impressive," he told his students, "but they're also complex. When something goes wrong, you need to understand not just what the computer is telling you, but what's actually happening with the aircraft. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution." The success of the program began to attract attention from other military branches and allied nations. Pilots from the Navy, Air Force, and Marines began attending the training, along with aviators from friendly foreign militaries who recognized the value of developing fundamental flying skills. "We're not trying to turn back the clock," Cassandra explained to a group of visiting officers from NATO countries. "We're trying to ensure that our pilots have the complete skill set needed to operate effectively in any environment. Technology is a tool, not a replacement for skill and judgment." As the program expanded, Cassandra found herself in the unusual position of being recognized as an expert in something that most of the military had considered obsolete. She was invited to speak at conferences, consulted on aircraft procurement decisions, and asked to review training curricula at flight schools around the world. But for all the recognition and success, She remained focused on the core mission, teaching pilots to fly when everything else failed. Because she knew that somewhere, in some future crisis, those skills would mean the difference between life and death. The old Huey still sat on the flight line at Fort Rucker, now designated as the program's official training aircraft. Students approached it with respect now, understanding that it represented not just a piece of history, but a direct connection to the fundamental principles of military aviation. This aircraft, Cassandra would tell each new class of students, has been flying for over 50 years. It's outlasted dozens of supposedly superior aircraft, and it's still here because it was built right and it's flown right. That's the standard we're training you to meet. The revolution that had started with one impossible mission in Afghanistan was now changing how the military thought about aviation training, aircraft procurement, and pilot development. And at the center of it all was a woman who had proven that sometimes the best solution was the one that everyone else thought was impossible. 5 years after the Eagle's Nest rescue, Chief Warrant Officer Cassandra Hayes stood at the podium of the National War College, addressing an audience of senior military officers, defense contractors, and foreign military attaches. The auditorium was packed with people who had come to hear the woman who had single-handedly changed military aviation's approach to training and operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, 5 years ago, I was a logistics officer flying supply runs in an aircraft that most people considered obsolete. Today, I'm here to talk about how that experience taught the military something it had forgotten, that sometimes the best technology is the one that never stops working. The audience was attentive, but Cassandra could sense the skepticism that still existed in some quarters. Despite the success of the Enhanced Aviation Skills program, there were still those who viewed traditional flying techniques as outdated relics that had no place in modern military operations. The Eagle's Nest mission succeeded not because we had better technology, she continued, but because we had the right technology for the specific circumstances. The Huey wasn't superior to the Black Hawks in any absolute sense. It was simply better suited for that particular mission. In the audience, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Swift nodded approvingly. He had become one of the program's most effective advocates, using his experience from the mission to convince skeptical commanders that traditional techniques had value even in an age of advanced technology. "The lesson," Cassandra said, "isn't that old aircraft are better than new aircraft. It's that we need to understand what each platform can and can't do, and we need pilots who can adapt to circumstances that weren't covered in their training manuals." The Enhanced Aviation Skills program had grown far beyond its original scope. What had started as a small training facility at Fort Rucker had expanded into a comprehensive curriculum that was now taught at military aviation schools around the world. The program had trained over 3,000 pilots, and its techniques had been credited with saving lives in dozens of missions where electronic systems had failed. But the real success, Cassandra continued, hasn't been measured in the number of pilots trained or the missions completed. It's been measured in the change in mindset. We've relearned that technology is a tool, not a replacement for skill and judgment. The program's impact extended beyond pilot training. Aircraft manufacturers had begun incorporating lessons learned from the program into their design processes, creating aircraft that were more robust and maintainable. Military procurement officers had started considering operational flexibility alongside technological sophistication when evaluating new aircraft. We've also learned something important about institutional memory, Cassandra said. The skills that saved lives at Eagle's Nest weren't new innovations. They were techniques that had been developed over decades of military aviation. We'd simply forgotten their value in our rush to embrace the latest technology. The audience included several of the soldiers who had been rescued from Eagle's Nest. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, now a senior NCO, had become an outspoken advocate for the program. Corporal Jessica Mitchell had completed medical school and was now a flight surgeon. working to incorporate lessons learned from the mission into military medical training. Chief Hayes, Rodriguez had said before the presentation, "I want you to know that what you did that day changed more than just our lives. It changed how the military thinks about impossible problems. Sometimes the best solution is the one that everyone else thinks won't work." The program had faced its share of challenges. Budget constraints had limited expansion, and some senior officers remained skeptical of training methods that emphasized pilot skill over technological capability. But the results spoke for themselves. Pilots trained in the program consistently performed better in challenging conditions, and mission success rates had improved across the board. The program has succeeded, Cassandra told the audience, because it addresses a fundamental truth about military operations. You can't predict every situation you'll encounter, and you can't build technology to solve every problem. Sometimes, you need pilots who can think, adapt, and improvise. The original Huey tail number 6717428 had been retired from active service and was now displayed at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. But its legacy lived on in the dozens of similar aircraft that were now being used to train pilots around the world. "That old helicopter," Cassandra said, "taught us that sometimes the best solution is hiding in plain sight. It taught us that experience and judgment are just as important as technology and procedures. Most importantly, it taught us that when conventional approaches fail, someone needs to be willing to try something different." The presentation concluded with a standing ovation, but Cassandra was already thinking about the work ahead. The program continued to evolve, incorporating new techniques and adapting to changing operational requirements. There were always new challenges, new problems that required unconventional solutions. After the presentation, she was approached by a young pilot, a recent graduate of the program, who had been assigned to a special operations unit. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to thank you. The techniques I learned in your program saved my crew last month when we had to make an emergency landing in hostile territory. My GPS failed, my radio was damaged, but I was able to navigate to a safe landing zone using dead reckoning." "That's what it's all about," Cassandra replied. "Making sure that when everything else fails, you still have the skills to complete the mission and bring everyone home." As the crowd dispersed, Cassandra found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. She had started as a logistics officer flying supply runs in an aircraft that everyone considered obsolete. Now she was recognized as a leading expert in military aviation training, sought after by governments and military organizations around the world. But the most important recognition came from the soldiers, whose lives had been saved by pilots trained in her program. They understood that the real lesson of Eagle's Nest wasn't about helicopters or flying techniques. It was about the willingness to challenge assumptions and try something different. When conventional approaches failed, the program would continue to evolve, adapting to new challenges and new technologies. But its core principle would remain unchanged, that military aviation required more than just advanced technology. It required pilots who could think, adapt, and perform when everything else failed. The future of military aviation, Cassandra had told her audience, isn't about choosing between old and new, traditional and modern. It's about understanding that the best solutions often come from combining the wisdom of experience with the capabilities of technology. The old Huey had proven that sometimes the most important mission was the one that everyone else thought was impossible. It had shown that experience, skill, and determination could overcome technological limitations and institutional barriers. And sometimes, that was the most important lesson of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.